Will Goldstein here, thekingscourt.com, and back to this series, C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity. This is the beginning of Book 2. Now, the first 6 videos were Book 1, and Book 1 was really about right and wrong and about the meaning of the universe. And like I said, this is the beginning of Book 2, which is what Christians believe. The title of this video is The Rival Conceptions of God. And also a chance to subscribe down there, and always check out my music, my songbooks, or my digital albums. And all the links are at thekingscourt.com or even at my YouTube page, The King's Court. So anyway, this again is video 7, and it's the first video in Book 2, and it's called The Rival Conceptions of God. So again, this is Lewis saying this. If you are a Christian, you don't have to believe all other religions are wrong all through. So in other words, there's some aspects of them that are right. I have a whole series on that, the world religions, with exactly that point. But if you're an atheist, he says, you have to believe. The main point is that all religions in the world are just simply a huge mistake. So that's, if you have the atheist view, that's the conclusion that you need to come to. And he was an atheist, Lewis, before he became a Christian. So basically he's saying that all religions, no matter how wild they seem, have some true element of truth in them. He uses the word some hint of truth. So, and he's getting into categories, and so he's saying Christians have different ways of thinking from other religions. He's saying that if you're a Christian, it does mean thinking that Christianity differs from other religions. He's saying they're not all the same. And it does mean that Christianity is right, and as a whole, the other religions are wrong. He actually says they're wrong. So I'll just leave it with what he says. And then he says, in arithmetic, there's only one right answer, and this is his reasoning. There's only one right answer to a sum, and the other answers are wrong. The only thing I might quibble with, Lewis about is, Judaism. Well, Judaism, unless they accept Christ, really is wrong. It's only partially right, because Christianity is the fulfillment of Judaism from a Christian point of view. So anyway, so he does go on about the idea about the arithmetic that there's only one answer that's right, but he does say that some of the wrong answers are much nearer and closer to the correct answer than others, which I would totally agree with. So basically, I agree with everything that he said. Now, the first division of humanity, there's the majority, and that majority believe in some kind of God or gods, and the minority are those that don't believe in any sort of God or gods, so atheists. And those are a very small percentage. I don't know whether, I think I've heard in the past that 5% of the world is atheist. That's a pretty small percentage. I don't know whether that's still true, but I've heard that in the past. So Christianity lines up with, even though it's different, it does line up with a lot of like ancient Greeks and Romans, and even modern savages and Stoics and Platonists and Hindus and Mohammedans. They all believe in God or some kind of God, and they are opposed to and against modern Western European materialism. Then he goes on to say that people who believe in God can be divided into categories as to what kind of God is this that they believe in. And he says there's basically two different ideas on this subject. And one of them is the idea that God is beyond good and evil. And he goes on to say that this is basically pantheism. And the idea with pantheism is these people who are pantheists would say that the wiser you become, the less you want to call anything good or bad. This is their idea, the pantheist idea. Because everything, God is everything. God is nature, and nature is God, so it's all good or bad. That's just part of it all. That's just part of God. That's just who God is. And this is not the Christian position. And they would say, pantheists would say, that everything is good in one way or in some sense and bad in another. And the reality is it really couldn't be any different than it is. That, again, is the pantheist view. Now, that's opposed to the Christian view. And the Christian idea is that God is quite definitely good and righteous. And he does take sides. He loves the idea of love. In the New Testament, God is love. That's a quote. He hates evil, and he wants us to cling to the good and the righteous and to behave in the way that he wants us to, and not to hate other people. And then he goes on and says, kind of goes back to the first idea of pantheism, and he says people like the Prussian philosopher Hegel, he gives an example of him. He gives an example of Hegel as being more of a pantheist, and he also sort of thinks that the Hindus are that way. And then he says that the other view, the more Christian idea of a good God, is more in line with the Jews and the Christians. He calls them the Mohammedans, or Islam. The current way things are going with Islam, some would question some of that, at least in some of the people in Islam, the terrorists I'm talking about. Pantheists believe that God, and I did a whole thing on pantheism, but pantheism believes that God animates the universe. The universe almost is God. And if it did not exist, then God would not exist either. So they're both essentially the same thing. The Christians think quite different than this. They think that God invented and made the universe. And to them, or the idea in Christianity is more like a man making a picture, or composing some kind of musical tune, or a painter painting a beautiful picture. And what he's saying is, if a painter paints a beautiful picture, and he does not die if his picture is destroyed. If God is nature and nature is God, you can see where he's going. They're the same. So, but he is saying that this God puts a lot of himself into the universe, and with all the beauty that we see and the interest that's before us. And this is his skill. So he exists, what he's saying is he exists outside and before nature. So that's why nature had to be from somewhere. And he's saying that God existed before the universe and before nature. And so he's using his skill and his artistic talents to create the universe. And then he says, if you don't take the distinction between good and bad very serious, then it's easy to say that anything in the world is part of God. But if you think that some things really are good and some things really are bad, and that God really is good, then you can't talk like that. There is a distinction. God is not bad. Okay, God is good. There's a distinction, even though bad exists in the world. So he's saying, as a Christian, you must believe that God is separate from the world. and that some things in the world are contrary to his will. This goes back to the fall. He doesn't give the idea of the fall. I'm just saying that this goes back to the fall in the garden. Now we're going to take a look at the divine point of view. And we're no longer talking this, and he uses these words, damn nonsense. I just quoted it. So, for Christianity, he calls it a fighting religion. And it thinks that God made the world, and by this, the space and time and heat and cold and the colors and tastes and animals, vegetables, and everything, all things. He just made it up out of his head, okay? And it's just a wonderful story that God came up with. And God thinks that many of the things that he created have gone wrong. In the world God had made and that God insists on and wants to bring about again, it's our job to put those things right again. This raises a very big question, and he's kind of reflecting back on the time when he was an atheist and the way he used to think back then. If God made the world, why has it gone wrong? If he's a good God, why has it gone wrong? And so he used to think about this, and this really used to bother Lewis before he became a Christian, when he was an atheist. And that was one of his main arguments against God. And he said he thought that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. So he got this idea in his head about just and unjust. And then he goes on and says something about a man doesn't call a line crooked unless he has some idea of what a straight line is. So, he's in reference to Christianity and righteousness, a straight line, make the path straight. Okay, so in other words, crooked is going off and deviating into sin. The argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, and he really felt that the world was unjust, and the world is unjust. He's right. No problem there. But then he thought the very act of trying to prove that God didn't exist, and the whole idea that the world was really senseless, it forced him to assume part of the reality. And that was the idea of justice. So in other words, you can't understand what unjust is unless you have some idea what justice is. And so when he came to reflect on the idea that he had an idea, even in his head as an atheist, that some idea of justice, and then the conclusion that he came to with atheism just seemed to be too simple for him. If the whole universe has no meaning, then how would he ever have found out that it has no meaning? Because the only way he discovered that it had no meaning was the idea that he had some idea of what meaning was, meaning justice. Then he says, if there was no light in the universe, then we should never know that it was dark. And the idea of darkness would be without meaning.